Jason Miller stood at the entrance of Westbrook High School, his heart pounding in his chest. The towering brick building loomed ahead, its windows reflecting the bright morning sun, but for Jason, the view only seemed to grow more intimidating as the seconds passed. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was his senior year, the year that was supposed to set the stage for everything that came after. And yet, he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. It wasn't that he didn't belong here, he had been attending Westbrook for 3 years already. But this year felt different. This year, there was a new teacher. A teacher who was already earning a reputation for her harsh, often controversial opinions. Mrs. Thompson. The name alone was enough to stir whispers in the halls. Jason adjusted the strap of his backpack and made his way through the crowded hallway, passing by groups of students catching up after the summer break. A few of them waved at him, but their smiles were either forced or barely noticeable. Jason was used to it. He'd always been a bit of an outsider, a kid who spent most of his time either in the library or the music room, away from the social scene. He didn't mind. Music was his escape. It always had been. As he rounded the corner to the classroom, Jason's stomach twisted with a mixture of nerves and curiosity. He had heard rumors about Mrs. Thompson's teaching style, how she often made racially insensitive comments under the guise of being honest or straightforward. Jason had seen the way teachers like her treated students like him, black, not from wealth, always fighting harder just to be seen as equal. It made him feel small, insignificant, even though he had worked hard to prove he was more than just his race. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The classroom was already half full, and the murmur of conversation quieted as students glanced up at him. The desk in front of the room was empty except for one figure, Mrs. Thompson, who stood at the blackboard, writing the day's agenda. Her back was to the class as Jason hesitated at the doorway, unsure of where to sit. There was a moment of silence before Mrs. Thompson turned around, her eyes locking onto his with an unsettling intensity. "Ah, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice sharp. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up. Late already?" The classroom was silent now. Jason felt the eyes of every student on him. It wasn't just the judgment that made him uncomfortable, it was the way she looked at him, like she was sizing him up, as if she already had him figured out. He swallowed hard. "I'm not late, Mrs. Thompson," Jason replied, his voice steady but his insides tightening. The bell just rang. She raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Instead, she pointed toward a seat at the back of the room. "Sit down, Mr. Miller. We don't have all day for your tardiness excuses." Jason bit his lip and made his way to the seat she'd indicated. As he sat down, he could feel the weight of the other students' eyes on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Thompson was still watching, still evaluating him. But this wasn't the time to make a scene, not with all eyes on him. He needed to prove himself, show that he wasn't the stereotype she likely assumed him to be. The bell rang, signaling the start of class. Mrs. Thompson finally turned back to the blackboard, her chalk squeaking against it as she continued to write. "Today, we're going to begin with some basic history. Slavery, segregation, civil rights, topics that are foundational to understanding American history. I trust everyone in this class has at least a basic understanding of these topics," she said, her tone no nonsense. "Mr. Miller, I assume you can handle this." Jason's stomach dropped. There it was again, her assumption that he didn't know the material, that he wasn't prepared. That all black students were somehow less capable. He gritted his teeth, determined not to let it show. "Yes, ma'am," Jason said evenly, though the knot in his stomach tightened. Mrs. Thompson turned to the class, surveying them with a critical eye. "Good. Because we'll be diving into the uncomfortable truths about this country. Don't expect me to sugarcoat things. History is messy, and we can't avoid the ugliness of it." Jason was used to hearing the brutal honesty of history, especially when it came to race. But Mrs. Thompson's delivery, her tone, it felt different. It was too clinical, too detached, as if she was reveling in making the students uncomfortable. He could sense the unspoken judgment in the room, a shared feeling that everyone was aware of but no one was willing to acknowledge. She launched into a lecture, her words flowing like a river of facts about slavery and the Jim Crow laws, but her delivery left something to be desired. There was no compassion, no empathy in her voice, just cold facts. As she spoke, Jason's mind wandered, his thoughts drifting to the music room at the end of the hall, where he had spent countless hours playing the piano. It was the one place where he could escape everything, his race, the judgment, the constant feeling of having to prove himself. In the music room, he was just Jason, the pianist. Nothing more, nothing less. But today, even that felt far away. Jason forced himself to focus, to pay attention, but the tension in the air was palpable. Mrs. Thompson's words felt like daggers aimed directly at him. At one point, she turned to the class and asked, "Now, who can tell me the real reason black people were kept in slavery for so long?" Jason felt the heat of the question sear into him. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. It wasn't just about history, it was about making him feel small, making him feel as though his very existence was the result of some grand historical mistake. His chest tightened as he raised his hand, despite the gnawing fear inside. "I think it was about power," Jason said, his voice steady despite the fire building inside him. "And control. Not just over people, but over resources and opportunities. Keeping a group of people down ensures that those in power can stay in control." Mrs. Thompson's lips curled into a tight smile. "Interesting. Mr. Miller, I didn't expect such an eloquent answer from you." The rest of the class remained silent, unsure how to respond. Jason didn't know if her comment was genuine or laced with condescension, but it stung just the same. He held his ground, even as she returned to the chalkboard, dismissing him and his answer. The rest of the lesson dragged on, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being under her scrutiny. It wasn't just the words, those could be ignored. It was the way she looked at him, the way she acted like his very presence in the classroom was an anomaly. As the bell rang and the class filed out, Jason lingered behind, reluctant to leave the safe confines of the room just yet. He needed a moment, just a moment, to gather himself. But as he stood up, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Malik, his best friend, giving him a questioning look. "You good, man?" Malik asked quietly, his voice full of concern. Jason exhaled slowly, forcing a smile. "Yeah. Just the usual." Malik didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "You know, you don't have to take that from her. If she's out of line, you should say something." Jason shook his head. "Nah. Not today. But I'll figure it out." With that, they both walked out of the classroom together, the weight of the first day of school hanging heavy in the air. It was going to be a long year. But Jason wasn't going to let Mrs. Thompson, or anyone else, define him. Not now, not ever. The fight had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jason Miller's life had never been simple. Growing up in the small, tight-knit neighborhood of Brookwood, he had learned early on that life often threw challenges your way when you least expected it. The streets he walked every day were not kind to people who looked like him, but somehow, Jason had always found a way to keep going. Music had been his refuge, his sanctuary, his way out. Jason's mom, Cheryl Miller, was the center of his world. A single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, she was the epitome of strength. She had big dreams for Jason, dreams that reached beyond the confines of their modest home. She often told him stories about how she had worked hard to put him in the best possible schools, to give him opportunities that she never had. Her voice, full of determination, resonated in his mind every time he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. Jason's memories of his childhood were a mix of love, sacrifice, and hardship. As a young boy, he had always been quieter than the other kids. He didn't fit the mold of the loud, energetic children who ran around the block playing basketball or riding bikes. Instead, he spent most of his time inside, where he could escape into his music. His mother had enrolled him in piano lessons when he was just 6 years old, hoping to give him a skill that would help him stand out. At first, he hated it. The long hours of practice, the relentless discipline, it all felt like a burden. But over time, the music became his voice. He remembered the first time he'd performed in front of an audience, his mom's face beaming with pride as his tiny hands played Beethoven's Ode to Joy at a neighborhood talent show. It wasn't much, just a small gathering of friends and family, but it was enough to ignite something in him. That feeling of standing on stage, the notes flowing effortlessly beneath his fingers, was the first time Jason realized that music could be more than just an escape. It could be his way of communicating with the world, of proving who he was without having to say a word. But even with his talent, Jason faced constant battles. School was always a challenge. Teachers often expected less of him, assuming that his background would somehow determine his success, or lack thereof. He'd had his fair share of teachers who gave him condescending smiles when he raised his hand, only to look surprised when he answered correctly. He could see the judgment in their eyes, the disbelief that a black kid from a working-class neighborhood could have anything of value to contribute. Despite the hurdles, Jason had managed to excel. He was a straight-A student, a quiet but determined achiever who always did his best. But the unspoken tension that came with being one of the few black students at Westbrook High School weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just the systemic challenges he faced, it was the microaggressions, the dismissive comments, and the way people seemed to expect less from him simply because of the color of his skin. The one place where he felt truly free, where he didn't have to worry about proving himself, was the music room. The music room was where Jason could lose himself in the notes, the rhythms, and the melodies that came to him so naturally. The piano was his best friend, his confidant, the one thing that never judged him. Jason's piano teacher, Mr. Green, had recognized his talent early on. Unlike many of the other teachers at Westbrook, Mr. Green didn't see Jason as a statistic or a stereotype. He saw him as a musician. Under his guidance, Jason had flourished, mastering complex pieces by Chopin, Mozart, and Rachmaninoff. He had a natural ear for music and an ability to bring even the most difficult compositions to life with ease. But despite his success in music, Jason knew that the real world wasn't going to give him a free pass just because he could play Beethoven with precision. It wasn't until the summer before his senior year that he truly began to understand the weight of the world he was carrying. That summer, Mrs. Thompson had come to Westbrook High as a new teacher. Jason had heard whispers in the halls about her reputation, how she was outspoken and unafraid to speak her mind, especially when it came to race and history. At first, Jason didn't think much of it. He had faced prejudice before, but he had first time and saw the coldness in her eyes, something shifted inside him. She wasn't like the other teachers who had shown their biases in subtle ways. Mrs. Thompson wore her prejudice on her sleeve, cloaked in the guise of honesty and truth. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for him to fail, just like so many others had before. His memories of the previous year flashed before his eyes, his interactions with his peers, the awkward silences when they found out he was good at something, his teachers who either ignored his potential or didn't quite know what to do with him. He wasn't the typical star athlete or class clown, he wasn't the popular kid or the one with a loud personality. He was the quiet, studious one, the one who could get straight A's without breaking a sweat. But it seemed like no matter what he did, there was always a sense of dismissal, a sense that he was never going to truly belong. As the days went by, Jason couldn't ignore the feeling that Mrs. Thompson's comments and behaviors were specifically aimed at making him uncomfortable. She seemed to relish the idea that someone like him, someone who came from a poor black neighborhood, couldn't possibly understand the history she was teaching. Every time she spoke, there was an undercurrent of condescension, as if she was daring him to challenge her, to step out of line, just so she could put him back in his place. Jason had made it through the first week without causing a scene, despite the jabs and the subtle digs. But today, in class, something had shifted. When Mrs. Thompson had called on him to answer a question about slavery, he had been ready. He had answered with the confidence he had gained over the years, but instead of recognizing the merit of his words, Mrs. Thompson had smirked and dismissed him. Jason's mind raced as he thought about what had happened earlier in the class. He had been humiliated in front of his peers, a silent target in a classroom where the air was thick with tension. But there was something more to it than just the classroom interaction. The deeper problem was how Mrs. Thompson wasn't the only one who saw him that way. Too many others, teachers and students alike, saw him as a problem, or a mystery, or a stereotype waiting to be fulfilled. It was as if they didn't believe someone like him could be anything more than a statistic. What they didn't understand was that Jason was determined to break through those barriers. He was determined to prove not only to Mrs. Thompson but to everyone who doubted him, that he wasn't some invisible, one-dimensional figure. They would see who he truly was. Jason could feel a deep resolve forming inside of him. He had spent too long letting other people define him. He wasn't just the quiet black kid in the back of the room. He was Jason Miller, a student, a musician, and someone who had worked harder than anyone realized to get to where he was. He wasn't going to let anyone, especially Mrs. Thompson, take that away from him. That night, after a long day at school, Jason sat at his piano in the dim light of his room. His fingers danced over the keys, the sound filling the space around him as he lost himself in the music. The notes were an escape, yes, but they were also his declaration. This was his voice, his statement, his way of fighting back. As he played, the tension of the day melted away, and he began to imagine a future where he didn't have to hide, where he could be both black and brilliant without apology. Maybe one day he would play on grand stages. Maybe one day, people would hear his music and finally see him for who he really was, not a stereotype, but an individual with dreams, with potential, and with something valuable to offer the world. But right now, in that moment, music was all he had. And that was enough. It had always been enough. The next morning, Jason woke up early, determined not to let yesterday's humiliation affect him. He knew today wouldn't be easy. Mrs. Thompson would surely continue her passive-aggressive tactics, but he wasn't going to back down. He made his way to school with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there the day before. As he walked through the gates of Westbrook High, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he also felt a sense of resolve. Today was going to be different. He wasn't just going to sit in Mrs. Thompson's class and let her words roll off his back. Today, he was going to show her, and everyone else, that he was more than just a label. He was Jason Miller, and he was going to rise above. When he walked into the classroom, Mrs. Thompson was already at her desk, sorting through papers. She glanced up as he entered, her expression unreadable. Jason sat down at his usual seat in the back of the room, but today, he didn't slouch or shrink away. He sat up straight, his eyes fixed on the front of the room. He wasn't going to let her silence him, not today. He was ready. As Mrs. Thompson began her lecture on the Civil War, Jason's mind began to wander, not to escape, but to think. He thought about how his ancestors had fought for their freedom, how they had endured far worse than anything he could imagine. He thought about the strength they had shown, the resilience they had cultivated. If they could do it, so could he. Then, Mrs. Thompson asked the class a question. It was a simple question about the impact of the Civil War on Black Americans, but Jason could hear the underlying challenge in her voice. She was baiting the class, waiting for someone to stumble. Jason raised his hand, and this time, when she called on him, he spoke with the authority of someone who knew the truth. The Civil War gave Black Americans a chance at freedom, but it also showed us how hard the fight would be. It wasn't just about winning a war, it was about gaining the right to live without oppression. Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed. She didn't expect him to respond so confidently. The rest of the class was silent, watching, waiting for her to react. Jason held her gaze, unflinching. It was in that moment, that small act of defiance, that Jason realized something: he was not going to let anyone, no matter how powerful they seemed, define him. He wasn't just a student in Mrs. Thompson's class. He was someone with his own voice, his own story. And it was time for him to take control of it. The following week was filled with more of the same, a subtle but constant tension in Mrs. Thompson's history class. Jason had expected as much. She seemed determined to challenge him, as if his quiet confidence was some kind of personal affront. But what Jason hadn't anticipated was just how far she would go to make him feel small. It wasn't just about the lessons anymore, it was about making sure he knew he didn't belong, making sure he felt every inch of the divide between them. It started innocently enough, at least, that's how Mrs. Thompson framed it. She began to target Jason more directly in class discussions, constantly questioning his answers and insinuating that his views were overly simplistic, or even naive. Jason had learned to keep his emotions in check. He wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing him get flustered. But something about the way she spoke to him felt different, as if she were trying to push him to his breaking point. One day, after a particularly uncomfortable lecture on Reconstruction, Mrs. Thompson asked Jason to stay after class. Jason's stomach tightened as the last bell of the day rang, signaling the end of the period. He lingered at his desk, gathering his things slowly, trying to prepare himself for whatever confrontation was coming. As the last student left the room, Mrs. Thompson walked over to him. Her steps were deliberate, each one echoing in the empty classroom. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice colder than usual, "I noticed something today. Your answers, well, they were quite articulate, but I can't help but wonder if you fully understand what you're talking about. Your perspective is interesting, but I think it lacks depth. History is complicated, and I'm not sure you're grasping just how messy it really is." Jason kept his gaze steady, despite the tight knot forming in his chest. "I understand more than you think, Mrs. Thompson. I've spent my life learning how to navigate the mess. It's what I have to do every day." She tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint smile. "That's an interesting way to put it. I'm just wondering if your experience is clouding your judgment. You're a smart kid, Jason. I'm sure you can do better than the simplistic answers you keep offering." Jason's fists clenched at his sides. He had expected this. Mrs. Thompson's veiled criticism was becoming predictable. She wanted him to be more than just articulate, she wanted him to fit the mold of what she thought a black student should be. But Jason wasn't about to be anyone's token, good student, just for her approval. "I think I understand perfectly," Jason said, his voice steady. "History may be complicated, but the truth doesn't change. The struggle for equality doesn't need to be complicated to be understood. I'm not here to fit your idea of what I should be. I'm here to learn and to share my perspective, just like everyone else." Mrs. Thompson's smile faltered, just for a moment. Then, she nodded slowly, her gaze hardening. "We'll see how far that attitude gets you, Mr. Miller. Just remember, not everyone is as forgiving as I am." Jason bristled at the implication. What did she mean by that? Was she threatening him, or was it just another one of her thinly veiled jabs? Either way, he wasn't going to let her get under his skin. He grabbed his bag and stood up. "I'll keep that in mind, Mrs. Thompson," Jason said with a tight smile, before walking out of the room. As he stepped into the hallway, Jason felt his breath come out in a rush. The last thing he needed was a teacher trying to undermine his confidence, but it wasn't just that, it was the realization that Mrs. Thompson wasn't going to stop. She was going to push him every chance she got, test him until he cracked. And Jason had to be ready for it. Later that evening, Jason sat in his room, the faint hum of the piano calling to him from across the room. He needed to escape, to calm his nerves before tomorrow's classes. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Mrs. Thompson's words. It wasn't just about the history lessons anymore. It wasn't even about her academic critique. It was about something deeper. She seemed to want him to prove himself in ways that felt unnatural, like she was trying to break him, trying to force him to acknowledge his place. Jason had seen it before in other people's eyes, those who expected less of him just because of where he came from. He had learned to brush it off, but Mrs. Thompson's tactics were different. She was more insidious, more calculating. She wasn't overt in her racism, but the way she treated him, the way she questioned him in front of the class, always felt like a trap. She was trying to make him feel like he wasn't good enough, like he didn't belong in the classroom, or anywhere else for that matter. But Jason wasn't going to let her win. He couldn't. He sat down at the piano and began to play, his fingers moving over the keys with ease. As the notes filled the room, he felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. Music had always been his refuge, the place where no one could touch him, where he was free from judgment. For just a moment, he could forget about the classroom, about Mrs. Thompson's challenge. It was just him, the piano, and the music. He played through the difficulties of the day, each note a quiet act of defiance. With every chord, Jason reaffirmed his resolve. He wouldn't let anyone define him, not Mrs. Thompson, not anyone. He was going to keep fighting for his place at this school, for his place in the world. He was more than what others saw. He was more than their assumptions, their biases. He was Jason Miller, and he was going to prove that he belonged. The next day, as Jason walked into Mrs. Thompson's class, the atmosphere felt different. The air seemed heavier, the tension more palpable. Jason had been prepared for this moment, he knew Mrs. Thompson wouldn't let up, but today, he was going to be ready for whatever she threw his way. As the class began, Mrs. Thompson launched into another one of her lectures. She wasn't looking at him as much this time, which was almost more unsettling than her usual attention. She had a new tactic, silent disregard. It was as if she were pretending he didn't even exist, as if he were invisible. Jason didn't let it bother him, though. He knew that silence was just as much of a weapon as words. Halfway through the lesson, she paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. It was a calculated pause, and Jason knew she was waiting for someone to speak up, to challenge her. He had a feeling she was going to target him again, looking for another opportunity to make him feel small. Finally, after a long silence, she turned to Jason. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice laced with that same icy edge. "You haven't contributed anything today. Would you like to enlighten us with your thoughts on the aftermath of Reconstruction?" Jason took a breath. He wasn't about to let her trap him again. He had been ready for this. He raised his hand, and when she reluctantly called on him, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. The aftermath of Reconstruction wasn't just about rebuilding the South, it was about creating a new reality for Black Americans. But it was also about the resistance from those who wanted to maintain the old power structures. The Black Codes, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, those were all signs that equality wasn't just a legal matter, it was a cultural one. The real challenge after Reconstruction was dismantling the systems of oppression that had been built over centuries. That's what made it so difficult. There was a beat of silence before Mrs. Thompson responded. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she gave a small nod. "Interesting," she said, her tone almost begrudging. "You actually know what you're talking about." Jason held her gaze, knowing full well that her words were still laced with judgment. But he didn't care. He had proven his point. Today, at least, he had won this round. The days following Jason's confrontation with Mrs. Thompson were filled with an unusual sense of unease. While he had won that particular battle, the war was far from over. It wasn't just about proving his intelligence or defending himself in front of the class. It was about the underlying tension that followed him every day, especially in Mrs. Thompson's presence. She had never been the type of teacher to let things go easily, and Jason knew she wouldn't take his challenge lightly. But Jason wasn't just concerned about her. He was beginning to notice something strange happening among his classmates. The subtle glances, the hushed whispers, there was a shift in how people looked at him now. It was as if they were watching him to see what would happen next. It was like Mrs. Thompson's criticism had cast a shadow over him, and now everyone else was waiting to see if he would crumble under it. By Thursday of that week, Jason could feel the weight of his every movement. The hallway seemed longer, the voices around him louder, the eyes more scrutinizing. He had always felt a bit out of place in school, but now it felt like the pressure was intensifying. Every conversation felt loaded with expectations, and every glance from his peers felt like a judgment. At lunch, Jason sat alone, picking at his food. His friends, Marcus and Tasha, hadn't been around much since the school year started. They had their own circle, their own friends, and Jason wasn't about to push himself into it. It wasn't that they had abandoned him, but the dynamics of high school were constantly shifting. He had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed in the background, and that was starting to feel even more isolating now. Marcus had always been Jason's closest friend, someone who had been there for him through thick and thin. But lately, he seemed distracted, too preoccupied with his own group of friends to notice Jason's discomfort. Tasha, on the other hand, was a different story. She was sharp, outspoken, and someone who had never been afraid to speak her mind. But even she had been avoiding him lately, her own social circles pulling her in different directions. As Jason sat there, mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, he heard the familiar sound of piano music drifting from the music room down the hall. He looked up, his gaze drifting toward the door. The sound of the piano had always been comforting, soothing. It was his escape, his refuge. But today, it felt like an invitation. He stood up, grabbed his tray, and tossed it in the nearest trash bin before walking toward the music room. It wasn't like he had any intention of playing. He just needed to hear the notes, to lose himself in something beautiful for a moment. When he reached the music room, the door was slightly ajar, and the sound of piano keys filled the air. Jason hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open fully. Inside, a girl he didn't recognize was sitting at the piano, her fingers moving fluidly over the keys. Her name was Lila, he recalled. She was a junior, a talented pianist who had a reputation for being a musical prodigy. Jason had heard about her but never spoken to her. Lila didn't stop playing when she saw him enter. She simply looked up, giving him a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't expect anything in return, the kind of smile that made Jason feel like he could just be himself for a few minutes. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not interrupting," Lila said, her voice light and warm. "I was just playing." Jason took a few tentative steps into the room, drawn by the music. There was something calming about the way she played. It wasn't showy or extravagant. It was simple, delicate, like she was weaving a story with every note. "I didn't know anyone else in this school played the piano like that," Jason remarked. Lila glanced up at him, her fingers pausing mid-song. "You play too?" Jason nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief at the question. It wasn't often he found someone who could relate to his passion for music. "I've been playing for years," Jason said. "Mostly classical stuff. But I play jazz too, sometimes." Lila's eyes lit up at the mention of jazz. "Jazz, huh? That's impressive. You play in any bands?" Jason shook his head. "No, not really. I just play for myself, you know." Lila nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. Music is the one thing that's just for you." Jason smiled, feeling an unexpected connection with her. In that moment, he felt like he wasn't invisible, like he wasn't just the quiet kid who blended into the background. He was Jason Miller, a pianist with something to offer. Lila's fingers started moving again, this time more confidently. She played a few bars of a familiar jazz tune, a song that Jason had learned to play years ago. Without thinking, he stepped forward and began to play along with her. It wasn't planned, but the way the notes fit together felt natural. The harmony between them was effortless, like they had been playing together for years. As they played, Jason felt the weight of the world lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in days, he wasn't worried about what Mrs. Thompson might say, or the whispers of his classmates. All that mattered in that moment was the music, the rhythm, the connection between him and Lila. After a few minutes, they stopped, both of them out of breath, but smiling. Jason couldn't remember the last time he had felt so light, so unburdened. "That was amazing," Jason said, still catching his breath. Lila grinned, her eyes sparkling. "You're not so bad yourself. Maybe we should do this again sometime." Jason felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The next morning, Jason found himself in a much different frame of mind. He couldn't wait to get to school, not because of Mrs. Thompson, but because of the music room, and because of Lila. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had found something real to hold on to. The weight of his challenges, the stress of school, the cruelty of Mrs. Thompson, none of it seemed as important when he thought about the music, the connection, and the quiet moments of peace he had found with someone who understood him. As he walked through the hallways that morning, Jason kept his head high. He wasn't going to let anyone see how much he had been struggling. Not today. Today, he was going to face whatever came his way with confidence. He wasn't going to shrink back into the shadows, and he wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Mrs. Thompson, make him feel like he didn't belong. Jason had found his voice in the music, and he wasn't about to lose it now. As the days passed, Jason's resolve began to solidify. The weight that had once pressed down on him now felt lighter, but it was still there, lurking in the background, especially when Mrs. Thompson was near. Her comments, though subtle, were constant reminders of the challenge Jason faced every day. It wasn't just about surviving in her class, it was about proving, over and over again, that he was just as worthy as any other student, no matter what she said or did. Despite his growing determination, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play. Mrs. Thompson's hostility toward him was not just academic, it felt personal. She wasn't just questioning his knowledge, she was questioning his right to be in that classroom, to be at that school. But Jason had found a new source of strength, Lila. He'd been visiting the music room every day, sometimes alone, sometimes with her, but always with the sense that he had found a space where he could be himself without judgment. She was a quiet, yet powerful presence, and her passion for music seemed to resonate with Jason in a way nothing else had. Their jam sessions had become a sacred time for Jason, a break from the battles he fought every day in the classroom. And it was during one of these sessions that Jason would face a new challenge, one he hadn't anticipated. It started simply enough, with the two of them sitting side by side at the piano, improvising to a smooth jazz tune. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow through the music room windows. "You know," Lila said, glancing over at him, "I can't help but notice how you play. It's like you're telling a story with every note." Jason smiled, glad to hear someone finally notice the way he poured himself into the music. "Yeah, that's the thing about jazz. It's more than just playing the right notes. It's about feeling it. It's about expressing something that words can't." Lila nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "You're really good at it. You ever thought about performing? Like, outside of school?" Jason hesitated, his fingers stilling on the keys. Performing? He hadn't even considered it. The idea of standing in front of an audience, knowing that everyone's eyes were on him, was something Jason had always avoided. He wasn't like Lila, with her natural confidence and ability to shine in the spotlight. Jason was more comfortable blending into the background, doing his thing without drawing attention. "I don't know," he said, trying to push away the wave of discomfort that surged through him. "I like playing for myself. I don't really need anyone else to hear me." Lila looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I get that. But don't you ever want to share your talent? To show people what you can do?" Jason didn't know how to respond. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had something special, something that could inspire others, but the idea of sharing it with anyone else made him feel exposed, vulnerable. He didn't want to risk being judged, especially not in a world that seemed so quick to dismiss him. Before he could say anything, the door to the music room opened, and in walked Mrs. Thompson. Jason's stomach twisted. He hadn't expected to see her here. Mrs. Thompson had always been so distant from the music department, she never seemed to care about anything that didn't fit into her strict, academic curriculum. So why was she here now? "Mr. Miller," she said, her tone cool but calculated, "I was just passing by and heard some interesting sounds coming from this room. I hope I'm not interrupting." Jason stood up slowly, trying to mask the unease that bubbled up inside him. "No, you're not interrupting." Lila gave him a sidelong glance but said nothing, her fingers resting on the keys, a soft tension in the air. Mrs. Thompson eyed them both for a moment before speaking again. "I didn't know you were such a music enthusiast, Jason. Perhaps I've misjudged you." Jason kept his face neutral, refusing to let her condescending tone get to him. "I've always played music, Mrs. Thompson." Her lips twisted into a faint smile. "I see. And I suppose you believe that music is a worthwhile pursuit, that it's just as important as history, for example?" Jason didn't like the way the question hung in the air. There was something about it that felt like a trap. "I think music is just as important as anything else," Jason replied carefully. "It teaches you discipline, creativity, and it helps you express yourself in ways that words can't." Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp. "That's an interesting take. But do you think you could ever apply yourself with the same passion to something that's, shall we say, more practical?" Jason felt his jaw tighten. She was trying to undermine him again, trying to make it seem as if his love for music was somehow less valuable than the so-called practical subjects like history. But he wasn't about to fall into her trap. "I don't think one has to be more important than the other," Jason said, his voice steady. "History teaches us about the past, but music teaches us about who we are. They're both important." Mrs. Thompson's eyes flickered with something, surprise, maybe. Jason wasn't sure. But instead of responding, she simply nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Very well," she said, her tone cold again. "It's your choice. But just remember, Jason, some things require more than passion. They require hard work. Commitment. Are you prepared to commit to something that will actually help you succeed in life?" Jason opened his mouth to respond, but Mrs. Thompson turned on her heel and left without another word, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. Lila was the first to speak, her voice quiet but sincere. "Don't let her get to you. You know what you're capable of." Jason let out a long breath, still processing what had just happened. "Yeah. I know. But it's not just her. It's everyone. It feels like they all want me to be something I'm not. Like music isn't good enough for them." Lila placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Music is enough. You don't need anyone's permission to follow your passion. Besides, if you let them dictate who you should be, you'll end up losing yourself." Jason met her eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. Lila was right. He couldn't let others define him. Not Mrs. Thompson, not his classmates, no one. The only person who could shape his future was himself. "I'm not going to let her get to me," Jason said, determination rising in his chest. "I've got bigger things to focus on." The rest of the week passed with more of the same, Mrs. Thompson's subtle digs, the awkwardness in the hallways, and the constant pressure to conform to expectations. But Jason held his ground. He spent more time in the music room, practicing, playing, and, most importantly, allowing himself to feel the music without apology. There was something liberating about it. With each note, each chord, Jason was reminded that he was enough, just as he was. The world might try to box him in, to make him fit a mold, but music was his escape, his way to show the world that he was more than their narrow definitions. And soon, he would prove that, in a way no one expected. Jason didn't sleep much the night after Mrs. Thompson's visit to the music room. Her words still echoed in his mind, but now, they felt like fuel to the fire that was steadily growing inside him. He had always kept his love for music private, like a secret he only allowed himself to indulge in when no one was looking. But now, something had shifted. He realized that he couldn't keep hiding who he was, especially in the face of challenges from people like Mrs. Thompson. The next day, Jason walked into school with a sense of purpose. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he was no longer going to let others define his worth. He wasn't just a kid trying to get through high school, he was a musician, an artist, and he was going to start living like it. When he arrived at the music room during lunch, Lila was already there, flipping through a sheet of music. She looked up as he walked in, her eyes lighting up with a small but knowing smile. "Hey, Jason. You seem different today," Lila remarked, her voice full of curiosity. Jason leaned against the piano, feeling the familiar weight of the keys beneath his fingertips. "I guess I am. I'm done hiding. I'm not going to let anyone make me feel small anymore." Lila nodded in approval. "Good. Because you're not small. You've got something special, and it's about time you show it off." Jason chuckled. "You make it sound so easy." "It is," Lila said with a grin. "You just have to believe in yourself. And if you want to prove something to anyone, do it with your music. Don't let anyone take that from you." Jason let out a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. For the first time, he truly felt like he could do something meaningful with his life. The weight of his earlier fears, of being judged and rejected, started to lift. That afternoon, Jason made a decision. He was going to sign up for the school's talent show. It wasn't a huge event, but it was a start, an opportunity to finally showcase his piano skills in front of an audience. He wasn't sure how he would feel when the day arrived, but for the first time, he felt excited instead of anxious. He had something to prove, not just to Mrs. Thompson or his classmates, but to himself. The next few days at school were filled with a new energy. Jason spent hours in the music room, practicing pieces he had always loved but never had the courage to perform. He began working on a powerful jazz composition, one that combined his classical training with the improvisation he loved. The music started to flow effortlessly, each note a step closer to reclaiming his voice. When Jason wasn't practicing, he was walking around with a sense of purpose. He ignored the whispers and sideways glances from his classmates. Mrs. Thompson's disapproving gaze didn't faze him anymore. He could almost feel her watching him from across the room as he sat at his desk, but he refused to let her stares break his focus. Instead, he kept his attention on the music, on his journey forward, on the thing that mattered most to him. By the time the talent show sign-up deadline rolled around, Jason had his piece ready. He walked up to the sign-up sheet in the school cafeteria with his heart pounding in his chest, but his resolve unwavering. He signed his name at the very top of the list, knowing that this was a big step forward for him. Lila was the first person he told. "I did it," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and nerves. "I signed up for the talent show." Lila's eyes sparkled with excitement. "I knew you would. You've got this, Jason. You're going to blow everyone away." Jason felt a rush of nerves, but they were different from the anxiety he'd felt before. This time, they felt like the anticipation of something new, something exciting. "Thanks, Lila," Jason said, his voice quiet but filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You don't need me to do it," she replied with a wink. "But I'm glad I could be there for you. Just don't forget to have fun, okay?" Jason nodded. It was easier said than done, but Lila's words stuck with him. For once, he was going to let go of the fear. He wasn't going to play for anyone's approval, he was going to play because it was who he was, and that was enough. The days leading up to the talent show were filled with anticipation. Jason continued to practice, refining his piece and allowing himself to become completely immersed in the music. But as the event drew closer, the pressure began to mount. He didn't just have to play in front of an audience, he had to do it in front of Mrs. Thompson, who would undoubtedly be watching from the crowd. And he had to do it in front of the entire school, a group of people who had spent the last few months watching him closely, waiting to see if he would live up to their expectations. The morning of the talent show, Jason woke up with a mixture of excitement and nerves. His hands were clammy as he got dressed, choosing a simple black shirt and jeans, comfortable, but sharp. He tried to focus on the music, but the thought of being the center of attention made his stomach churn. He wasn't a performer by nature. He had always preferred the quiet, behind-the-scenes approach. But this was different. This was his moment to shine, and he wasn't going to let anything hold him back. When he arrived at school, the atmosphere was buzzing with energy. Posters for the talent show were plastered all over the hallways, and students were gathered in groups, talking about what they planned to perform. Jason's nerves flared again, but he took a deep breath and reminded himself that this wasn't about anyone else. This was about him. At lunchtime, he found a quiet spot in the music room to warm up, his fingers brushing over the keys. His piece was starting to feel natural now, the music flowing like water through his fingers. For the first time, Jason felt like he belonged, like the music was a part of him, and he didn't have to hide it anymore. Just as he was finishing his warm-up, Lila walked in. She gave him a thumbs up and smiled. "You're ready," she said confidently. Jason smiled back, a sense of calm settling over him. He wasn't just doing this for the applause or the recognition. He was doing it for himself. The talent show was set to begin after school, and as Jason walked into the auditorium, his heart raced. He took a deep breath and sat down at the grand piano on stage, his fingers hovering over the keys. The room was dark except for the spotlight that shone down on him, but he didn't see the faces in the crowd. All he saw was the piano in front of him, the music in his soul, and the moment that had finally arrived. Jason closed his eyes and began to play. The music began to flow from Jason's fingertips, smooth and steady at first, building gradually into a complex melody that filled the entire auditorium. His nerves were still there, buzzing faintly in the back of his mind, but the music washed over him like a wave, pulling him into its rhythm. He wasn't thinking about the crowd. He wasn't thinking about Mrs. Thompson, or the whispers from his classmates, or the challenge of being seen in a new light. He was just playing. The piece Jason had chosen was a combination of classical technique and jazz improvisation, two things that had always fascinated him. The opening chords were rich and deliberate, with a touch of elegance. But as the melody progressed, Jason's hands flew across the keys, weaving in and out of jazzy, syncopated rhythms. He felt the music in his chest, his heartbeat sinking with each note, each phrase. For the first time, he wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He wasn't trying to silence the voices in his head telling him he wasn't good enough. He was simply lost in the music. The spotlight above him seemed to fade away, and the auditorium blurred into the background. The only thing that mattered was the piano in front of him and the story he was telling with every note. This wasn't about being perfect, it was about being real. He let himself make mistakes, embrace the rough edges, and lean into the moments of unexpected beauty that came with improvisation. As the piece neared its climax, Jason's fingers danced across the keys, building intensity, and the music seemed to lift him off the ground. He felt his breath quicken, but his hands moved instinctively, as though they knew the path they were meant to take. He could hear the sounds of the audience, quiet at first, then gradually swelling as the music reached its peak. He opened his eyes briefly, catching sight of Lila in the front row. She was watching him intently, her expression one of pure support. And that was all he needed. He pushed through, letting the music carry him forward. The final chord was a powerful resolution, and as Jason played it, he felt a rush of emotion flood through him, pride, relief, and a sense of triumph. The piece ended, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, as if on cue, the crowd erupted into applause. Jason blinked, taken aback for a second. The sound of the clapping filled his ears, loud and overwhelming. He had expected a polite round of applause, but this was different. The energy in the room was electric, and it took him a moment to realize what was happening. People weren't just clapping because it was the polite thing to do, they were clapping because they had been moved. He had done it. He had opened himself up, shared his passion, and the audience had responded. For a moment, he stood there, frozen at the piano, unsure of what to do. Then, slowly, he stood up and gave a slight bow. His heart was still racing, but now, it was filled with something he hadn't expected, joy. Real joy, the kind that came from doing something that felt true to who he was. As he made his way off the stage, Lila was waiting for him, her smile wide and proud. "You were amazing," she said, her voice almost breathless. "I told you, you've got this." Jason laughed, the tension of the past few months melting away. "I can't believe it. I didn't expect that kind of reaction." Lila's eyes sparkled. "You've got a gift, Jason. It was your moment. People were just waiting for you to show them who you are." Before Jason could respond, he heard a voice behind him. "That was incredible, Jason." He turned around to see Mrs. Thompson standing there, her arms crossed in front of her, but her expression was different. There was no scorn in her face, no dismissal in her tone. Instead, there was something resembling respect. "I didn't realize you had that in you," she said, her voice surprisingly neutral. Jason took a deep breath, his chest still full of adrenaline from the performance. "I guess I surprised you." Mrs. Thompson's lips twitched into something like a smile. "I've been known to be surprised from time to time." Jason didn't know how to respond to that. For a moment, it felt as though the years of tension between them had melted away. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. The applause was still ringing in his ears, and he turned back to Lila, his heart still racing. The talent show continued, with other students performing, but Jason's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop replaying the moment on stage, how the music had flowed so effortlessly and how the audience had responded. He had shown them who he was, who he really was, and that felt more empowering than any grade, any approval, or any compliment he could have received. At the end of the show, Jason found himself standing in the back of the auditorium with Lila, watching the final performers. It was hard to concentrate on anything else. His mind was still buzzing with excitement. "You did it, Jason. You really did it," Lila said again, her voice soft but full of pride. "I did," Jason replied, still not quite believing it. "I really did." The announcement came over the speakers, calling all the participants to the stage for the closing remarks. Jason was swept into the group of performers, a mixture of classmates, teachers, and friends. He felt different now, more confident, more alive. As they all took the stage together, the applause from the audience still echoing in his ears, Jason realized something profound: this wasn't just a talent show. It was a turning point in his life. For the first time in a long time, he was proud of himself. For the first time in a long time, he knew that no matter what Mrs. Thompson, or anyone else, thought of him, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had embraced who he was, flaws and all, and he had shared that with the world. And that was worth more than anything. After the show ended, Jason found Mrs. Thompson again. She was waiting by the exit, as if she had something important to say. "I have to admit," she said, "you proved me wrong. I may not have understood your passion for music at first, but I see it now. You have something special, Jason." Jason looked at her, feeling a mix of emotions. It wasn't a full apology, but it was progress. It was the kind of acknowledgement he had been waiting for, the kind that told him he wasn't invisible after all. "Thank you," he said simply, unsure of what else to add. Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Keep going. Don't let anyone make you feel small. Not me, not anyone. And just like that, a weight lifted from Jason's shoulders. He wasn't just a student in her class anymore, he was someone who had found his voice, and no one could take that away from him. As he walked out of the auditorium, Lila by his side, Jason felt like a new person. He was no longer the kid who hid behind his piano. He was Jason Miller, the musician, and that was just the beginning. The weeks following the talent show felt like a whirlwind to Jason. The rush of performing, the applause, and the sense of accomplishment all lingered in his mind. His peers began to treat him differently, more respectfully, with admiration even. Lila continued to be his biggest cheerleader, constantly encouraging him to keep pursuing music and to continue playing with confidence. But despite the positivity, there was an underlying challenge Jason hadn't expected. It wasn't the pressure to keep performing or the fear of people's judgment. It was the unspoken weight of proving himself every day in a school that hadn't always believed in him. As the final months of the school year approached, Jason felt the familiar ache of uncertainty creeping in. He had started to gain some confidence, but doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. He hadn't yet earned the full respect of everyone, especially not Mrs. Thompson. Despite her acknowledgement at the talent show, he still felt the distance between them. One afternoon, Jason sat in the school courtyard, strumming his guitar. It had become one of his new habits, just sitting outside with his guitar, letting the music flow as a way to unwind after the school day. He was lost in the rhythm, his fingers moving almost automatically, when he heard a voice behind him. "Nice to see you're not just a one-hit wonder." Jason looked up, startled to see Mrs. Thompson standing a few feet away, arms folded, a slightly amused expression on her face. He wasn't sure what to make of it. Part of him wanted to respond with a sarcastic remark, but another part of him felt oddly grateful that she was even acknowledging him at all. "I don't know if I'd call it a hit," Jason said, giving her a half-smile. "But it's been a good few weeks." Mrs. Thompson raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You know, I never expected you to be one of the ones who would step up like that. I had you pegged as the shy, quiet type." Jason shrugged. "I was. But, things change." Mrs. Thompson studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm glad you decided to share your music. But let's see how much you really have in you. I want to see you play something challenging." Jason's heart skipped a beat. "Something challenging? Like what?" "I'm not talking about another piece for the talent show," Mrs. Thompson said, her tone sharpening. "I mean something that pushes you. Something that shows whether you really have the chops or not." Jason felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't an invitation to share his music, it was a challenge. Mrs. Thompson wasn't satisfied with what he had done. She wanted more. "Like what?" Jason repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "Something classical," she said, her voice cool. "Or jazz. Something you can't just wing. I want to see your technique, your skill. No shortcuts." Jason wanted to argue, to push back against her sudden criticism. But the look in her eyes told him this wasn't just about being difficult. She wanted him to push himself even further, to prove that his talent wasn't a fluke. It stung, but part of him knew she had a point. "Okay," Jason finally said, trying to sound confident. "I'll do it. I'll pick something challenging." "Good," Mrs. Thompson said, nodding once. "I'll be watching." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jason sitting there, his fingers still hovering over the strings of his guitar. He felt a rush of emotions, fear, excitement, and something else he couldn't quite name. This wasn't just about pleasing an audience anymore. It wasn't about gaining respect. It was about proving to himself that he could take his music to the next level, no matter how tough the challenge. The next few days were filled with tension as Jason searched for a piece that could meet Mrs. Thompson's standards. He pored over his sheet music, flipping through classical piano pieces, jazz compositions, and even some experimental music. Nothing seemed quite right. They all felt either too easy or too complex. But then, one evening, while practicing at the piano, Jason found a piece that resonated with him, a fusion of jazz and classical influences, full of intricate rhythms and emotional depth. It wasn't easy, but it felt like something he could make his own. He spent hours that week practicing. His fingers were sore from playing such a challenging piece, and his mind felt stretched as he worked through the tricky passages. But as the days passed, something clicked. The music no longer felt like a daunting mountain he had to climb. Instead, it became a challenge he could embrace. He could hear the music, feel it in his bones, and he knew this was the right piece. One day, as Jason practiced in the music room, Lila came in, as always, to check on him. "You've been at it for hours," she said, raising an eyebrow. "How's it going?" Jason let out a long breath, wiping his forehead. "It's tough. But I think I've got it." Lila's face lit up. "I know you do. You've got the talent for this, Jason. Just make sure you don't overthink it. Let the music come to you." Jason smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude. Lila had always been there for him, offering words of encouragement when he needed them most. This time was no different. "Thanks, Lila. I'm doing my best." But despite the support, doubt still crept into Jason's mind. Would he really be able to pull this off? Mrs. Thompson had set a high bar, and the thought of performing in front of her again, this time with something even more challenging, was daunting. He wasn't just trying to impress a teacher anymore. He was trying to prove that he could handle whatever was thrown his way. The next week, Jason was ready. He had worked tirelessly on the piece, refining his technique and embracing the difficulty. He knew that Mrs. Thompson's challenge was more than just a test of his musical ability, it was a test of his perseverance and his willingness to push beyond his limits. When the day came for him to perform in front of her again, his heart raced. The auditorium was empty except for Mrs. Thompson, who was sitting at the back, arms crossed, watching him with a level of intensity that made him feel like he was back on that stage from the talent show. Jason took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and began to play. The room was silent, save for the sound of Jason's fingers striking the keys of the piano. As the first notes of the piece filled the space, he could feel his nerves start to settle. The hours he had spent practicing this complicated fusion of jazz and classical had led to this moment. This was the real test, not just of his musical ability, but of his growth over the past few months. He wasn't just playing to impress anymore, he was playing to prove to himself that he could overcome any challenge. His fingers danced over the keys, each note crisp, each chord perfectly timed. But as he reached the middle section of the piece, things began to get complicated. The tempo picked up, and the jazz-infused rhythms demanded everything from him. There were moments where his fingers nearly slipped, where his mind seemed to falter, but Jason pushed through, just like he had during the talent show. He remembered Lila's advice, "Let the music come to you." As he entered the most challenging part of the composition, a sudden thought hit him. What if he couldn't do it? What if he faltered in front of Mrs. Thompson, and everything he'd worked for came crashing down? But instead of allowing the doubt to take over, Jason focused on the music. He remembered the way it had felt in the music room, how the rhythm had carried him, how the notes had felt like they were flowing through him. This was no longer just a series of notes on a page. This was an expression of everything he had been through, the hard work, the frustration, the triumph, and yes, even the moments of failure. He played through the difficult passages with confidence, letting each note soar into the air like a breath of fresh air. And then, finally, it was over. Jason took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, the music still lingering in the air. For a second, there was nothing but silence. The auditorium seemed to stretch out before him, as if time had stopped. Then, slowly, he turned to face Mrs. Thompson. She was still sitting in her chair, her arms crossed, but her expression was unreadable. Jason waited, his stomach churning. He had no idea what she was thinking, but he knew that this was the moment that could either make or break him. For what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Thompson said nothing. Then, finally, she spoke. "Well," she said slowly, her voice cutting through the silence. "You certainly didn't make it easy for yourself." Jason's heart skipped. He wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. She leaned forward in her chair, her gaze intense. "You took risks. I'll give you that." Jason held his breath. Most students would have played something safe. Something they knew they could ace, Mrs. Thompson continued. But you didn't. You chose something that required precision, skill, and guts. And you pulled it off. It wasn't flawless, but it was real. Jason felt the tension in his chest start to ease. It wasn't perfect, he hadn't expected it to be, but the fact that she was acknowledging his effort meant more to him than anything else. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet. "I wanted to challenge myself." "I can see that," Mrs. Thompson said, nodding. "You've come a long way, Jason. There's still a lot of work to be done, but you've proven that you have what it takes. You don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Just keep pushing yourself. Keep playing from the heart." Jason didn't know how to respond. He had always struggled with finding his place in this school, with getting people to see him for who he really was. But in this moment, as Mrs. Thompson spoke, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't the same kid who had sat in the back of her class, trying to go unnoticed. He wasn't the same kid who had struggled to find his voice. He was someone who could stand up, take risks, and show the world what he was capable of. For the first time in a long time, Jason believed it. After their lesson, Jason left the music room, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The performance had taken everything out of him, but it had also given him something he hadn't realized he needed: validation. He had proven to himself that he could take on a challenge, no matter how difficult it seemed. And that meant everything. Lila was waiting for him outside the music room, her smile wide when she saw him. "So?" she asked eagerly. "How did it go?" Jason grinned, his heart still racing from the performance. "It went better than I expected." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Better than you expected? What does that mean?" "I don't know," Jason said, shrugging. "It wasn't perfect, but Mrs. Thompson said I did a good job. She said I took risks and played from the heart. That's a big deal, I guess." Lila's eyes sparkled with pride. "I knew you could do it. I knew you'd make it through. You've come so far, Jason." Jason smiled, feeling a wave of warmth wash over him. "Thanks, Lila. I couldn't have done it without you." They stood there for a moment, just basking in the aftermath of the performance, before Lila spoke again. "So, what's next for you? Are you planning to perform at the next talent show or something?" Jason thought about it for a moment. The idea of performing again was both exciting and intimidating, but it felt different now. He wasn't performing to prove something to others. He was performing because it was who he was. "I don't know," he said with a small laugh. "Maybe I'll play in a real concert one day. Something bigger. But right now, I just want to keep playing. Keep getting better." Lila beamed. "I know you will. You're going to go far, Jason." Jason couldn't help but smile back. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally on the right path, one that would lead him wherever he wanted to go. He had a long way to go, but he knew he was ready to face whatever came next. The weeks following Jason's performance in front of Mrs. Thompson were a blur. The school year was winding down, but Jason wasn't focused on the end of the semester or the approaching summer break. His mind was fully consumed by his music. Every spare moment he had was spent at the piano or with his guitar, learning new pieces, pushing himself, and challenging his skills. Lila was with him through it all. They spent hours together, Jason playing while Lila offered her encouragement. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. It wasn't just about the music anymore, it was about growth, personal transformation, and support. Lila had been his rock through all of it, always there to cheer him on when he doubted himself. But despite the progress he was making, something still gnawed at him. Mrs. Thompson's challenge had opened a door for him, but there was still that lingering question, was he really good enough? He had gained respect from his peers and had earned a modicum of recognition from Mrs. Thompson, but there were still whispers in the hallways, still those who doubted him, and most of all, the feeling that no matter how far he went, it wouldn't be enough for everyone. One afternoon, after a particularly intense practice session, Jason sat alone in the music room, the last of the students having left for the day. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Jason stared at the keys of the piano, his fingers resting lightly on them. What's next for me? He thought. He knew he was good, but there was still a part of him that felt unworthy. Maybe it was the pressure of having to keep up with the success he had found in the talent show or the weight of Mrs. Thompson's continued scrutiny. Maybe it was the thought of what his future could hold, or more specifically, what it couldn't hold if he failed to live up to his own expectations. That's when Mrs. Thompson entered the room, as if on cue. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching him. Her gaze wasn't as sharp as it had been before. There was something softer about her now, like she had been waiting for him to come to this realization on his own. You're thinking too much again, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice cutting through the silence. Jason looked up at her, startled. What do you mean? You're worrying about the wrong things, she said, stepping into the room and taking a seat at the piano bench next to him. I can see it in your face. You've been pushing yourself, but you're pushing yourself toward the wrong goal. You're not doing this for the right reasons anymore. Jason frowned, not understanding. I'm not doing it for the right reasons. What do you mean? Mrs. Thompson sighed, her voice gentler now. You've been so focused on proving yourself to others that you've lost sight of why you started playing in the first place. You wanted to make music because it brought you joy. Because it was who you were. But now, you're chasing validation. You're chasing approval. And it's clouding your vision. Jason's heart skipped. Was that true? He had been so caught up in the praise and recognition, in proving to everyone, including himself, that he was more than just the quiet kid at the back of the class. But had it all become about the approval of others? Do you remember the first time you sat down at that piano? Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice softening. You weren't playing for anyone else. You were playing because you loved it. You were lost in the music, just you and the keys. That's what you need to get back to. Forget about what anyone else thinks. Forget about the talent shows and the challenges. Just play. Play because you need to. Jason's hands trembled slightly as he thought back to the first time he had ever touched a piano. He remembered the wonder of it all, the way the keys had felt beneath his fingertips, the way the music had flowed out of him without thought, without hesitation. Back then, there was no pressure, no audience. It had been just him and the music. Suddenly, Jason felt a wave of clarity. He had lost that feeling, that purity of why he started playing. It had all become about pleasing others, about showing that he was good enough, worthy enough. But music had never been about that. It had always been about expression, about the way it made him feel. Why had he let it become so complicated? Maybe you're right, Jason whispered. Maybe I've been doing it for the wrong reasons. Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes softening. You're a talented musician, Jason. But the greatest music comes from within. Don't forget that. Jason nodded, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. He was tired of carrying the expectations of others, tired of constantly worrying about what everyone thought. He wanted to find that joy again, the joy he had once felt when the music was all that mattered. That evening, after school, Jason returned to the music room one last time before the end of the day. He sat at the piano, his fingers poised over the keys. This time, he didn't think about Mrs. Thompson or the talent show. He didn't think about proving anything to anyone. He just played. The music that came out was raw, unpolished, but it felt real. It was the music that had been buried under all the pressure, waiting to come back to life. Jason felt the melody in his bones, his heart beating in time with the rhythm. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't worried about what anyone else thought. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just playing for himself. And it felt good. Lila appeared in the doorway, watching him with a smile. She had been waiting outside, unsure of when Jason would finish. But the moment she saw the look on his face, she knew he had found something important. He had found his way back to what truly mattered. "That sounds amazing," Lila said softly. "I can tell you found your rhythm again." Jason looked up, his face lighting up with a genuine smile. "Yeah," he said, his voice full of realization. "I think I have." Lila stepped into the room, sitting beside him. "I'm really proud of you, Jason. You've come so far." Jason smiled back, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He was no longer the same kid who had been afraid to speak up. He wasn't just the quiet student or the one who always had to prove himself. He was a musician. And that was enough. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the email came. Jason was sitting in his usual spot in the library, the sound of raindrops tapping against the windows, absorbed in his music theory homework. He had been slowly getting back to his old self, rediscovering his passion for music. The pressure that had once consumed him was now a distant memory, replaced by the simple joy of playing. That was until the email notification pinged on his phone. It was from Mrs. Thompson. Subject: Special opportunity for you. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he clicked on the email. Mrs. Thompson had a way of making even the simplest messages seem important. Jason. I hope you're doing well and still keeping up with your music. I wanted to reach out to you with a special opportunity. There's an upcoming music competition being held at the local university, and I've spoken with the organizers. I believe you have the talent and potential to do well. It's a big step, but I know you're capable of it. If you're interested, let me know and we can talk details. Looking forward to hearing from you. Mrs. Thompson. Jason stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to absorb what he had just read. A music competition? The thought both excited and terrified him. He had gotten used to playing for himself, for the joy of music, but the idea of competing again, putting himself out there in front of a crowd, made him nervous. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the air as Jason glanced around the quiet library. He could almost hear the voice of his former self telling him he wasn't good enough, that he would only fail if he took this on. But there was another voice now, the voice that had grown stronger with each practice session, with each note played. It was the voice of the kid who had dared to show up at the talent show, despite all the odds. He knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, Jason tapped out his reply. Mrs. Thompson. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm definitely interested. Please let me know what the next steps are. He hit send, his pulse quickening. What was he getting himself into? The last time he had been in a competition, he had been terrified. But this time, something was different. He wasn't doing it to prove anyone wrong, to fight against the stereotypes or expectations. He was doing it because he loved music. And maybe, just maybe, this was the next step in his journey, one that he was ready to take. The following week, Mrs. Thompson arranged a meeting with the competition organizers, and Jason found himself in a small conference room at the university. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, but he tried to remain calm. Mrs. Thompson sat beside him, her reassuring presence like a steady anchor as they were introduced to a panel of judges and event coordinators. Jason felt a twinge of nervousness, but he pushed it aside. He wasn't here to impress them. He was here for himself. The competition would be held in 2 months, giving Jason plenty of time to prepare. As Mrs. Thompson spoke with the organizers about logistics and the details of the event, Jason's mind began to wander. He thought back to his first lesson with Mrs. Thompson, to the days when he was too afraid to even speak up in class. Now, here he was, preparing for a public competition, ready to put himself out there again. Lila's voice echoed in his mind, urging him forward. "You've got this, Jason. I believe in you." The feeling of determination that had been building inside him surged again. This was his chance, not just to showcase his talents, but to prove to himself that he had come so much further than he had ever imagined. The weeks leading up to the competition were filled with both excitement and pressure. Jason had to balance his regular schoolwork with hours of practice. Mrs. Thompson was supportive, but she also pushed him hard, always challenging him to take his music to new heights. They spent countless hours together, refining his technique, adjusting his interpretation of the piece, and making sure everything was perfect. But it wasn't always easy. Jason found himself frustrated at times, doubting his abilities, and wondering if he was making a mistake by signing up for this. Every time he made a mistake, every time something didn't sound right, his old insecurities crept back in, and he almost considered quitting. But Mrs. Thompson wouldn't let him give up. "Remember why you started playing in the first place," she would say. "This isn't about the competition. It's about expressing yourself. You are ready for this. Trust me." It was in those moments that Jason remembered what Mrs. Thompson had taught him, about the importance of playing for himself and not for anyone else. That was the key to success, and it was what he clung to when the pressure felt like it was too much to handle. As the competition day drew closer, Jason's anxiety grew. It wasn't the music that scared him anymore, it was the fear of being judged, of putting himself out there for everyone to see. But he knew that if he didn't take this opportunity, he would always wonder what could have been. He couldn't let fear hold him back, not this time. Finally, the day of the competition arrived. Jason was at the university early, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. The auditorium was grand, far larger than any venue he had ever performed in. The stage was set with grand pianos, each one gleaming under the bright lights. Musicians were tuning their instruments, warming up for their performances. Jason could feel the tension in the air, but he kept his focus on what he had to do. Lila was there with him, of course, offering him the same support she always had. She gave him a hug as he stood backstage, ready to take the stage. "You've got this, Jason," she said, her words a quiet reassurance. "Just remember, you're here for yourself, not anyone else." Jason smiled and nodded, the nervous energy running through him. He wasn't sure if he was fully ready, but he was ready to try. And when the announcer called his name, Jason stepped onto the stage, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the piano. The audience was watching, the silence almost deafening. He could hear his heart thumping in his chest, but he took a deep breath and sat down. The moment his fingers touched the keys, the music began to flow. The stage was a sea of bright lights, blinding Jason for a moment as he settled into the piano bench. He could hear the rustling of the audience, whispers, shuffling feet, but all of it felt distant, muffled. His mind was in a different place, his focus narrowing to the keys in front of him. He had been preparing for this day for weeks, but now, as the spotlight hit him, it felt like everything was on the line. He took a deep breath and steadied his hands. The nerves were still there, lurking just beneath the surface, but Jason had learned to acknowledge them without letting them control him. He had done this before. He could do it again. His fingers found the first note. The melody poured out of him as if it had been waiting to be released. The music didn't feel like a performance, it felt like an expression, a story that only Jason could tell. Each note was a part of him, a piece of his soul laid bare for the world to hear. As he played, the world outside the auditorium faded away. There was only the music, and in that moment, he was no longer the quiet kid trying to prove himself. He was just a musician, lost in his art. The sound of the piano filled the space, flowing with ease and confidence, each note blending seamlessly into the next. Jason's hands moved with fluidity, as though he was dancing with the piano, every movement instinctual and filled with passion. His piece was a complicated one, full of intricate runs and dramatic shifts, but as his fingers danced across the keys, they felt natural. It was the culmination of all his hard work, the hours spent practicing, the lessons learned from Mrs. Thompson, and the rediscovery of his own love for music. And though there were moments when he stumbled, small imperfections that he quickly corrected, he didn't falter. He had learned to trust himself, to keep playing no matter what. The audience was silent, hanging on every note. Jason could feel their attention on him, but it didn't pressure him. He wasn't performing for them. He wasn't performing for anyone except himself. The realization came to him, just as he had practiced so many times, when he played with everything inside of him, when he let go of all the doubt and fear, the music spoke for itself. As the piece came to an end, Jason held the final note, allowing it to resonate in the air. The auditorium was still. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. Then, slowly, the silence broke into applause. Jason didn't immediately stand up. Instead, he took a moment, his hands still resting on the keys, absorbing the sound of the applause, feeling the warmth of it wash over him. It was as if the validation he had been chasing for so long didn't matter anymore. He had done it. He had played the music for himself, and that was enough. He stood up, bowing slightly, but the moment was brief. He was already thinking about the next challenge, the next step. But for now, he allowed himself to enjoy the feeling of having truly given his all. Backstage, the tension lifted as Jason walked off the stage. Lila was waiting for him, her face glowing with pride. "You were incredible," she said, her eyes sparkling. "I knew you could do it." Jason smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had been so nervous going in, but now that it was over, he realized something: he had not just impressed others. He had impressed himself. The fear of judgment had disappeared as soon as he stopped caring about it. For the first time in a long time, he had played the music for the pure love of it. Mrs. Thompson approached him, her expression unreadable at first. Jason braced himself for her usual sharp critique, but instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did well," she said simply. "I'm proud of you, Jason." Jason nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you. You were right. I did it for myself." Mrs. Thompson smiled, her eyes softening. "That's the best reason to do anything." Before Jason could respond, one of the competition organizers approached them. He was a middle-aged man with glasses, his expression serious as he handed Jason a small envelope. "Jason," he said, "I just wanted to let you know that the judges were very impressed with your performance. We'll be announcing the winners soon, but I wanted to personally congratulate you on your exceptional skill." Jason blinked in surprise. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The organizer gave him a small nod and walked away, leaving Jason with Mrs. Thompson and Lila. "Do you think I have a chance?" Jason asked, his nerves returning as the reality of the competition settled back in. Mrs. Thompson smiled knowingly. "Jason, you're already a winner. What you did today was incredible. It's not just about winning a trophy. It's about the journey, and you've come so far." Jason felt a rush of emotion, his heart swelling with pride. The idea that he could have started from a place of doubt and fear and reached a point where he could stand on stage, playing his heart out, was something he could never have imagined just a few months ago. Lila grinned and nudged him. "And don't forget, I was right all along. You've always been this good." Jason laughed, his nerves fading completely as he looked at his two biggest supporters. "Maybe," he said, "but I think I've just started to believe it." The announcement of the winners came an hour later, and Jason stood beside Lila and Mrs. Thompson, waiting for his name to be called. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for anymore. Winning would be nice, but it wasn't the end-all be-all for him anymore. He had already achieved something much bigger than a trophy. When the third-place winner was announced, Jason's heart skipped a beat. Then, as the second-place winner was called, his palms began to sweat. It was down to the final announcement. The first-place winner. The announcer paused, scanning the audience, and then called out Jason's name. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Jason stood there, frozen. He had won. His mind raced, but all he could do was blink in disbelief. Lila was the first to grab his arm, pulling him forward with an ecstatic scream. Mrs. Thompson clapped him on the back, a proud smile on her face. Jason's legs felt like jelly as he walked up to the stage to accept his award, but when he held it in his hands, everything seemed to fall into place. He had done it. Not for anyone else, not for approval, but for himself. And that was worth more than any trophy. As the applause rang out, Jason realized that the journey he had taken had been far more important than the destination. The weeks after the competition were a whirlwind for Jason. He had received congratulations from everyone, from his friends to his teachers to complete strangers who had seen his performance. The trophy, a small but significant symbol of his hard work, sat on his desk, a constant reminder of the journey he had taken. But even more meaningful than the trophy were the lessons he had learned, the personal growth that had come from the experience. Still, as the euphoria of his victory faded, Jason found himself asking, "What's next?" It had been easy to lose himself in the excitement of the competition, but now, back in the regular rhythm of life, the questions loomed large. Was this the end of his musical journey? Was he simply meant to play piano for himself, in his room, or did he have something more to offer the world? Jason wasn't sure. He spent the following weeks back in school, quietly reflecting. His grades were still decent, but it was clear to him that his passion had shifted. Music wasn't just a hobby anymore, it was his passion, his escape. And while he had once been content to play for his own joy, he now felt the pull to share that joy with others. It was a Wednesday when the opportunity knocked on his door. Mrs. Thompson approached him after class, her expression serious but warm. "Jason," she said, "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I know you've won the competition, but I feel like there's something even bigger for you. The school's spring concert is coming up, and I'd like to invite you to perform as a featured soloist." Jason blinked in surprise. Me? A soloist? The idea of performing in front of his classmates, teachers, and parents was daunting. He had only performed in a small competition, not in front of an audience that included people he saw every day. Mrs. Thompson smiled, as though she had expected his reaction. "Yes, you. I know you're ready, Jason. This could be a great way for you to take the next step. To really start sharing your talent and your story. But it's your decision." Jason felt his heart race. The thought of performing at the school concert made his stomach flip, but there was something else bubbling inside him, excitement. This wasn't just about impressing anyone or checking something off a list, it was about taking another step forward. About continuing to grow. "I don't know," he said, looking down at his shoes. "It feels like a big step. I don't know if I'm ready to perform in front of everyone like that." "I understand," Mrs. Thompson replied gently. "But I've seen you grow so much already. And I believe this could be the moment where you truly find your voice, not just as a musician, but as a person. The stage can be a powerful place, but only if you're willing to step into it." Jason's mind raced. He thought back to the competition, the nerves, the anxiety, and the triumph he had felt once he let go of the fear and embraced the music. Could he do that again? Lila was the first person he called that afternoon. He needed to talk it through with someone who understood him, someone who had seen him struggle and overcome. "Hey, Lila," Jason said, his voice slightly hesitant. Mrs. Thompson asked me to perform as a soloist at the spring concert. What do you think? Should I do it? Lila's response was immediate, her voice filled with excitement. Oh my gosh, Jason. Yes. You absolutely should. You've already done so much, and this is your chance to take everything to the next level. Plus, it's a huge honor. I know you're nervous, but I've seen you on stage. You're amazing. Jason couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. It was always infectious. But the nerves were still there, churning in his stomach. I'm scared, Lila, he admitted. I know I've come a long way, but, performing in front of my classmates? What if they don't like it? Lila's tone softened. Jason, they're going to love it. You've got something special, and that's what matters. The whole school has seen you struggle, and they've seen you overcome it. This is your chance to show them who you really are. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. She was right. The people at his school had watched him go from the quiet, insecure kid to someone who had found his voice. Now, it was time to show them that he wasn't done yet. That he had so much more to give. I guess I could do it, Jason said slowly, as the excitement started to grow inside him. I'll do it. The preparations for the spring concert began almost immediately. Mrs. Thompson worked closely with Jason, selecting a piece that was challenging but also meaningful. It wasn't just any piece, it was one that had a personal connection for him, a composition that told the story of his journey. It was the same piece he had performed at the competition, but now, it had an added layer of significance. As the concert drew nearer, Jason spent hours practicing, his fingers flying over the keys, his mind fully immersed in the music. But unlike the competition, this time it felt different. The stakes were higher. He wasn't just performing to win something, he was performing to share his story with the people who had been with him through it all. The day of the concert arrived, and the air was thick with excitement and nerves. The school gymnasium had been transformed into a performance space, with rows of chairs arranged for the audience. Jason stood backstage, dressed in his concert attire, his palms sweating. He was nervous, but it wasn't the same kind of fear he had felt before. This time, it was the kind of nervousness that came with anticipation, the thrill of the unknown. Lila was there, of course, sitting in the front row with a wide grin on her face. She gave him a thumbs up as he glanced in her direction, and Jason couldn't help but smile back. Mrs. Thompson found him backstage just before he was called to the stage. You're ready, Jason, she said, her voice calm and reassuring. Just remember, this is your time. You've worked hard, and you have a story to tell. Play for yourself, and everything else will fall into place. Jason nodded, taking a deep breath. He was ready. Ready to share his passion. Ready to show everyone who he was, not as the kid who had been overlooked or underestimated, but as someone who had fought for his place on that stage. When his name was called, Jason walked out to the front of the stage, the spotlight hitting him as the audience fell silent. He took a moment to look out at the sea of faces, his friends, teachers, even strangers. They were all there to witness this moment. And then, he sat at the piano and began to play. As Jason's fingers pressed the first note of the piece, a wave of calm washed over him. It wasn't just the music that settled his nerves, it was the realization that this was no longer about impressing anyone or proving anything. He wasn't playing for the competition or for the judges. He was playing for himself. This performance, unlike the competition, was about sharing the journey he had been on and the lessons he had learned. His hands moved effortlessly across the keys, each note clear and deliberate. He played the piece with passion, letting the music reflect his growth. Every chord, every run, felt like an echo of the struggles he had faced, his insecurities, his doubts, the loneliness. But it was also a testament to how far he had come. He was no longer the shy, quiet kid who hid behind the piano, he was someone who had embraced his talents and his story. As he continued playing, the audience became more than just a group of faces in front of him. They became witnesses to his transformation. Jason didn't need to look at the crowd, but he could feel their attention, their support. The music connected him to them in a way words never could. With every measure, his confidence grew. There were moments where the music swelled into powerful crescendos, and Jason let his emotions pour into the keys. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm, lost in the expression of the music. Then, just as quickly, the piece would calm again, transitioning into a delicate melody that mirrored the moments of quiet introspection Jason had come to know so well. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt free. The stage wasn't a place of judgment, it was a space for him to be fully himself. His hands moved with precision, the music flowing effortlessly as he embraced each note, each moment of silence, each surge of emotion. As the final note echoed through the gymnasium, Jason held it for a brief, perfect moment. It wasn't a dramatic end, but rather a soft, reverent conclusion. The note lingered in the air, carrying with it all the emotion Jason had poured into it. And when it finally faded, the room was silent. For what felt like an eternity, there was no sound, just the hushed reverence of the audience, holding their breath. Then, slowly, the applause began. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a roar, a heartfelt appreciation that filled the room. Jason could feel the energy shift, the air alive with excitement and admiration. He stood up from the piano, his chest swelling with a mix of relief and pride. The applause continued, and Jason took a bow, a genuine smile spreading across his face. For a moment, he allowed himself to savor the moment. He had done it. He had shared his truth. And in return, he had received something far more valuable than a trophy, he had received the respect and admiration of everyone in the room. Backstage, the reality of what had just happened began to set in. Jason was still processing the intensity of the performance, his mind racing. As he walked off the stage, Lila was waiting for him, her face glowing with pride. "You were amazing, Jason," she said, pulling him into a hug before he could even respond. "I knew you could do it. You totally crushed it." Jason laughed, feeling his nerves finally ease. "Thanks, Lila. I think I finally understand what you meant when you said that it was about more than just the music. It wasn't about proving anything. It was just about being myself." Lila grinned. "Exactly. And that's when you're at your best. When you stop worrying about what others think and just let the music speak for itself." Jason felt a wave of gratitude for his friend. She had been there for him from the beginning, supporting him when he doubted himself, pushing him to keep going when things felt impossible. Her belief in him had always been unwavering, and now, it was paying off. Just as they started to walk back toward the dressing room, Mrs. Thompson found them. Her face was lit up with pride, and there was a glint of something deeper in her eyes. She didn't say anything at first, instead, she just gave him a long, thoughtful look. "You were incredible," she said, finally. "I'm so proud of you, Jason. You've come such a long way. You didn't just play the piano tonight, you told a story. Your story." Jason nodded, feeling a swell of emotion rise in his chest. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I couldn't have done it without your help." "You did all the work," she replied with a smile. "I just gave you the space to find your own voice." As they continued talking, Jason felt something shift inside him. He had always been afraid of being vulnerable, of showing who he truly was. But tonight, he had done it. He had allowed himself to be fully seen, to expose the parts of him that had been hidden for so long. And, in doing so, he had found a connection with his audience that went beyond applause or validation. The next day at school, things felt different. It wasn't that anyone was treating him differently, but there was a sense of respect that hadn't been there before. His classmates approached him with more genuine interest, asking him questions about his performance and telling him how much they had enjoyed it. But it wasn't just about the performance, it was about the person who had stood on that stage, vulnerable and open, sharing a part of himself that few people knew existed. Jason found himself walking through the hallways with a newfound confidence. His head was held a little higher, his steps a little steadier. He no longer felt like the outsider, the quiet kid in the back of the class. He was someone who had found his place, not by conforming to others' expectations, but by embracing who he was, flaws and all. In the days that followed, Jason received several invitations to perform at local events and even some private functions. It was clear that the impact of his performance hadn't just been felt in the auditorium, it had ripple effects that reached far beyond that one night. But even as these new opportunities presented themselves, Jason found himself thinking about something else entirely, the future. Music had become more than just a hobby. It had become a passion, one that he wanted to pursue further. But what would that look like? Could he turn this into something more than just a side project? The questions lingered, but for the first time, Jason felt confident enough to seek the answers. He didn't have to have everything figured out right away. What mattered now was that he was on the path to finding it, and he was no longer afraid of taking the next step. In the weeks following the spring concert, Jason's life seemed to shift in subtle, yet significant ways. Every day felt like a new possibility, and with each passing moment, he began to understand more deeply what he had been avoiding for so long. The stage, the piano, the music, they were no longer just outlets for him to express his talents. They were the foundation of something much bigger, something that had the potential to shape his future. Despite the rush of new opportunities, performances at local venues, invitations to play at charity events, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something still felt incomplete. He was grateful for all the attention and praise, but he found himself questioning whether he was truly living up to his full potential. Was he just reacting to the events around him, or was he truly creating a path for himself? He spent nights contemplating what it meant to be a musician. He had always played because he loved it, because it gave him an outlet for his emotions. But now, as he looked toward the future, he began to wonder if he could pursue music on a larger scale. The idea of going to a music conservatory or majoring in music had always felt like a distant dream, something out of reach for a kid like him. But now that he had experienced the thrill of performing and the validation that came with it, the thought of making music his life no longer seemed as impossible. Jason talked to Lila about his thoughts one afternoon as they walked home from school together. "I don't know what to do, Lila," he admitted, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. "I love music. But I keep thinking that maybe I could do more with it. I've been getting more invitations to play, and it feels good, but what if I'm just playing in the background? What if this is as far as I can go?" Lila looked at him, her expression serious. "I don't think you're just playing in the background, Jason. You're already doing more than you realize. The way you played at the concert, that wasn't just some show. You were telling your story, and people felt that. Maybe you haven't figured out exactly what the future holds, but you're already on the path. You just have to trust it." Jason stopped walking and turned to face her. "But how do I trust it, Lila? I don't know if I can do this for the rest of my life. I don't know if I'm even good enough." Lila raised an eyebrow. "Are you seriously telling me that you, of all people, aren't good enough? Jason, you have something special. And it's not just about being the best player in the world. It's about being authentic. The way you play, the way you connect with the audience, it's unique. People don't just want to hear the music, they want to feel it." Jason stood there for a moment, processing her words. He had never thought about it that way. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being real. And when he played, when he allowed himself to be vulnerable with the music, that was when the audience truly connected with him. Maybe he didn't need to have it all figured out. Maybe the journey itself was enough. He smiled at Lila. "Thanks. You're right. I guess I've been overthinking it. Maybe I don't need all the answers right now." Lila grinned back. "Exactly. Just take it one step at a time. Who knows? This could be the beginning of something really amazing. That evening, Jason found himself sitting at the piano again. His fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, uncertainty creeping in once more. But instead of getting lost in his thoughts, he began to play, allowing his fingers to wander across the keyboard. He didn't have a specific piece in mind, but soon, a melody emerged, soft at first, almost tentative, but then it began to build. The music flowed through him, and he realized something profound: he wasn't just playing the piano. He was telling a story, again. His story. The more he played, the more his thoughts began to clarify. Music wasn't just about technique or accolades. It was about expression, about connecting with others on a deeper level. The concert had been the first step, but now he understood that there was more to this journey. He wasn't just going to perform for people. He was going to share himself, to show the world who he was and what he had to offer. And that was worth more than any trophy or recognition. That night, Jason made a decision. He would take the next step. He would apply to a few music schools, schools that had always seemed out of his reach but were now within his grasp. He wasn't sure if he would get accepted or what the future held, but he knew he had to try. The next morning, he sat down at his desk and began drafting his applications. It wasn't easy. There were essays to write, recommendations to request, and deadlines to meet. But this time, he felt a sense of urgency, a sense of purpose. He wasn't just going through the motions. This was his future, and it was time for him to take control of it. Weeks passed, and as Jason continued with his application process, his performances kept him grounded. He played at a few more events, each one more comfortable than the last. His confidence grew with each note, each audience. But what truly kept him going was the knowledge that he was finally taking ownership of his journey. The piano, once a tool of escape, had become a tool of self-discovery. One afternoon, as he was practicing for a performance at a local fundraiser, Jason received an email that made his heart stop. It was an acceptance letter to one of the music conservatories he had applied to. He stared at the screen for a long moment, not fully able to comprehend what he was reading. Was this real? Had they really accepted him? The email congratulated him on his acceptance, and his mind raced as he scanned the rest of the message. He was officially a student at one of the most prestigious music schools in the country. His dreams, the ones he had pushed to the back of his mind for so long, were now a reality. Jason's eyes welled up with tears. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that validated everything he had worked for. And yet, even in the midst of his joy, there was a quiet fear. What would the future look like now? Would he be able to keep up? Was he truly ready? He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. He was scared, yes, but he was also incredibly proud. He had made it. And he wasn't going to stop now. The next few days passed in a blur. Jason couldn't stop replaying the email over and over in his mind. He had been accepted to one of the top music conservatories in the country. It was everything he had ever dreamed of, yet a wave of uncertainty swept over him. He hadn't expected this to happen. He had convinced himself that applying to these schools was a pipe dream, something to do just to say he tried. But now that it was real, he was filled with both excitement and a paralyzing fear. The week following the acceptance was filled with conversations with his family, his friends, and mentors, all celebrating the news. But despite their encouragement and pride, Jason felt more alone than ever. He had spent so long hiding behind his music, afraid of the world seeing who he truly was. Now, he had to face the reality of stepping into a new world, a world where he would be surrounded by people who were probably better, more talented, and more accomplished than he could ever be. His parents were thrilled about the opportunity. His mother was already planning a trip to help him buy supplies and get ready for the new chapter of his life. His dad was practically glowing with pride. But Jason couldn't shake the thought that they might be expecting more from him now, that this acceptance wasn't just a personal victory but a reflection of their dreams for him as well. He wasn't sure if he could live up to that. It was Lila who brought him back to reality. As always, her perspective grounded him. Jason, you've earned this. You didn't get into that school because someone felt sorry for you. You got in because you're talented and passionate and you've worked your ass off to get here. You're not the same person you were a year ago. You've grown so much. They were sitting in the park one afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the grass. Jason had come here to clear his head, but instead, his mind was more cluttered than ever. I know, but, what if it's all too much? Jason confessed, his voice tinged with doubt. What if I'm not good enough? What if everyone else there is miles ahead of me? I've only just begun to understand what this all means. What if I can't keep up? Lila didn't hesitate. You've got to stop thinking like that. You're not competing with anyone. You're on your own path. This is about your journey, Jason. Don't measure yourself by someone else's timeline. Look how far you've come. And trust that you'll keep growing. Jason nodded slowly, taking in her words. He had always struggled with the idea of comparison, feeling like he was always playing catch-up. But Lila was right, this wasn't about competition. It was about him embracing the journey, taking it step by step. The day Jason left for the music conservatory, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. It felt like a lifetime had passed since that fateful day at the competition when he first realized that music could be more than just a form of escape. But as he packed his bags and left his hometown behind, he couldn't deny the anxiety bubbling up inside him. Was he making the right choice? Could he truly handle the intense pressure of a conservatory? And most importantly, was he ready to face the next stage of his life, where everything would be on the line? His family drove him to the conservatory, a prestigious institution nestled in a quiet area of the city. As they arrived, the size and grandeur of the campus took him by surprise. It was nothing like his high school, or even the local college where he had taken piano lessons. The sprawling campus was filled with beautiful, ivy-covered buildings, and students walked around with a sense of purpose that Jason had never known. His parents were excited, helping him with his bags as they walked toward his dorm. Jason could barely take in his surroundings. Everything felt foreign. It was hard to picture himself here, surrounded by students who had probably been playing music for much longer than he had. What if he wasn't ready for this? After settling into his new dorm room, Jason went out to explore. The campus was beautiful, but it felt intimidating, as though it were a world entirely separate from the one he had known. The students he saw seemed confident, their heads held high, their strides purposeful. He felt small in comparison. Later that evening, as he unpacked and arranged his belongings, he felt a wave of loneliness wash over him. This was it. This was the moment he had dreamed about, but it wasn't turning out the way he had imagined. It wasn't glamorous or inspiring, it was scary. What had he gotten himself into? But then, as if by fate, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lila. Hey, I know this is a huge change, but I just want to remind you that you belong there. You've earned every single moment of this. Don't let fear talk you out of it. And if you ever feel like you can't do it, remember that you've already done the hardest part, believing in yourself. You've got this. Jason read the message 3 times. Lila always knew exactly what to say. Her words brought a sense of calm, and he took a deep breath. Maybe he wasn't ready yet, but he would be. He had to believe in that. The next few days were a whirlwind of orientations, meetings with faculty, and introductions to fellow students. Everyone seemed so confident, so sure of their place here, while Jason felt like an imposter. But it didn't take long for him to realize that everyone was struggling in their own way. Some were terrified of the workload, some of being away from home, some of failing. It was comforting to know that even the most accomplished students here had doubts of their own. Jason had always been someone who kept his struggles to himself, hiding behind his music and his quiet nature. But here, he realized, there was a community, people who understood what it felt like to chase a dream, to risk everything for a passion. The more he talked to his classmates, the more he realized they shared his fears. They were all here for the same reason, because they loved music and were willing to do whatever it took to make it their life. One of the first things Jason did was seek out a piano teacher, Professor Matthews, a renowned pianist who was known for pushing his students to reach their highest potential. Jason was nervous, his hands clammy as he entered the professor's office. Professor Matthews was an older man, his face weathered by years of experience, but his eyes were sharp, observant. He studied Jason for a moment before speaking. "So, you're the young man everyone's been talking about, the one who played in that competition." His voice was warm but firm. "Tell me, Jason. Why do you play the piano?" The question took Jason by surprise. He had never been asked something like that before. His mind raced, trying to form an answer. He thought back to the concert, to the moment he had played for the first time without fear, the moment he had truly been himself. "I play because it lets me express what words can't," Jason finally said, his voice steady. "It's how I connect to the world. It's how I tell my story." Professor Matthews nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Good. That's the kind of answer I like. Let's see what you've got." Jason took a deep breath and sat at the piano, his fingers grazing the keys. For the first time since arriving at the conservatory, he felt at peace. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone. All he needed to do was play. And that was enough. The weeks that followed Jason's arrival at the conservatory felt like a series of waves crashing against him. Some days, he felt on top of the world, fully in control of his music and his emotions. Other days, he was overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what he had signed up for. The coursework was intense, the professors demanding, and the level of talent around him left him feeling small in comparison. Professor Matthews had a reputation for being tough but fair. Jason's first few lessons with him were grueling. The professor would often stop him mid-performance, urging him to go back and try again, dissecting each note, each phrase with precision. "You're not just playing music, Jason. You're telling a story. Every note must be intentional. Every silence, every pause, these are as important as the sound. Your music should breathe. It should live." At first, Jason struggled with the pressure. He had always played instinctively, following his gut and relying on his passion to carry him through. But now, under the scrutiny of Professor Matthews, every tiny imperfection was exposed, every missed note was a glaring reminder of how much he still had to learn. There were days when Jason left the piano room feeling frustrated and exhausted, wondering if he was truly cut out for this. He had been accepted into the conservatory because of his talent, but here, he was just one of many students fighting for attention, fighting for recognition. The doubts that had been creeping in since his arrival grew louder, and Jason found himself questioning his abilities more than ever. Lila's words echoed in his mind, "You've got this." But on the bad days, it was hard to believe them. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult lesson, Jason decided to take a break and clear his mind. He wandered through the campus, finding solace in the quiet corners of the conservatory. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his own expectations. He had always been the kid who stood out in his hometown, the prodigy who could play anything on the piano. But here, he was just another student, trying to find his place in a world that seemed bigger than he had imagined. He eventually found a quiet bench near the conservatory's main hall. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the courtyard. Jason pulled out his phone, scrolling through his messages. There was a text from his mom, asking how he was adjusting. There was also a message from Lila, reminding him to check in when he could. Jason smiled to himself, grateful for the people who cared about him, even from afar. He typed a quick response to Lila, "It's harder than I thought, but I'm getting through it. I just need to keep pushing." He stared at the message for a moment before hitting send. He didn't want to admit it, but he needed help. He needed to talk to someone who understood what he was going through. Later that evening, as he was preparing for another round of practice, Jason's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Professor Matthews. "Meet me in the practice hall at 7 p.m. I want to hear you play something from your heart. Don't overthink it. Just play." Jason's heart raced. He had no idea what the professor wanted, but the request was simple enough. The tension that had been building within him seemed to dissipate slightly. Maybe this would be a chance to let go, to stop worrying about the technicalities and just play. At 7 p.m. sharp, Jason walked into the practice hall. Professor Matthews was already there, seated at the back of the room, observing quietly. The large grand piano sat in the center, its polished wood gleaming under the lights. "Go ahead, Jason. Play what's on your mind," the professor said, his voice soft but commanding. Jason nodded, his fingers brushing against the keys. He closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on the music rather than the pressure. He played a simple melody, one that had been lingering in his mind for weeks, a reflection of the emotions he had been carrying with him since arriving at the conservatory. The notes were raw, unpolished, but they were genuine. They were Jason. As he played, he could feel his worries start to fade. It was no longer about hitting every note perfectly. It was about the story he was telling through the music. He played with abandon, letting the melody flow through him, letting it become an extension of his thoughts and feelings. When he finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Jason opened his eyes, unsure of what to expect. Professor Matthews sat still, his face unreadable. For a moment, it felt like an eternity. Then, Professor Matthews stood up and slowly walked toward him. Jason braced himself for criticism, but when the professor spoke, his tone was different, gentler, more thoughtful. "That was good, Jason. Really good. I can hear your voice in the music. But now, you need to find a way to make that voice stronger. To let it resonate in the way you approach every piece you play." Jason blinked, not fully understanding. "I don't know if I can. I've been so focused on trying to get everything right, on being perfect, that I forgot how to play from the heart." Professor Matthews nodded. "That's the trap most musicians fall into. We get so obsessed with technique and perfection that we forget why we started playing in the first place. You have something special, Jason. You just need to trust it." Jason took a deep breath. The weight of the professor's words sank in. He had been so consumed by fear of failure that he had lost sight of the joy he once found in the music. Maybe this was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, the reminder that music was about expression, not perfection. The next few weeks were a turning point for Jason. He began to shift his mindset, focusing less on getting every note perfect and more on connecting with the music. Each lesson with Professor Matthews felt like a mini revelation, as Jason discovered new depths to his playing. He no longer saw his mistakes as failures, they were simply part of the process, part of the journey. But the real challenge was still ahead of him, the final performance at the conservatory's spring concert. The students who performed at this event were expected to deliver their best work, and for Jason, it was the ultimate test. Could he truly embody the lessons he had learned? Could he deliver a performance that was not just technically sound but emotionally powerful? As the concert date approached, the pressure mounted. Jason spent long hours in the practice hall, pouring everything he had into his performance. He wasn't sure what would happen that night, but one thing was certain, he would give everything to the music. When the night finally arrived, Jason stood backstage, his heart racing. The audience was filled with professors, students, and alumni, people whose opinions mattered, whose expectations weighed heavily on his shoulders. He took a deep breath, reminded himself of Professor Matthews' words, and stepped onto the stage. It was time to tell his story. The stage lights were blinding at first, but as Jason stepped into the spotlight, the nerves that had been building for weeks began to settle into a quiet focus. The audience's murmurs faded into a hushed silence, and for a moment, Jason felt completely alone. It was just him and the piano, two entities bound by a shared purpose. He walked to the grand piano, his fingers lightly brushing the keys as he sat down. His heart was racing, but there was a strange sense of calm within him. This wasn't just about getting through a performance anymore. It was about something deeper. It was about telling his story, one note at a time. Professor Matthews' words echoed in his mind, "Don't overthink it. Just play from your heart." Jason took a deep breath and placed his hands on the keys. The first few notes were soft and tentative, like a whisper at the beginning of a conversation. But as he continued, the music began to take on a life of its own. He poured every ounce of emotion into each phrase, letting the music carry him through his doubts, his fears, and his triumphs. There was a freedom in the music now that he hadn't felt before. The perfection he had once chased seemed irrelevant. Instead, what mattered was the connection between him and the piano, him and the audience, him and the part of himself he had kept hidden for so long. He let the music flow, drawing from the deep well of emotions he had experienced during his time at the conservatory. There were moments of tension, of uncertainty, but there was also a feeling of release, a sense of liberation. For the first time, he wasn't playing to impress anyone. He wasn't playing to prove something. He was playing to express the very essence of who he was. As he neared the climax of the piece, Jason felt a wave of emotion rush over him. This was it. This was the moment he had been preparing for without even realizing it. He wasn't just playing notes. He was telling the story of his journey, of his struggles, his fears, his growth, and his triumphs. The final chords resonated in the hall, and Jason let the sound hang in the air for a few moments before his hands slowly lifted from the keys. The silence that followed was deafening. For a brief moment, Jason was unsure what to expect. He held his breath, wondering if the performance had landed the way he had hoped. Then, the applause came, slow at first, then growing louder, more thunderous. Jason's heart leapt in his chest as he stood up and bowed, his face flushed with a mixture of pride and disbelief. He had done it. He had stepped onto the stage and shown everyone, not just his peers and professors, but himself, who he truly was. As the applause continued, Jason's eyes searched the audience, landing on Professor Matthews. The older man was clapping, his face lit up with a proud smile. Jason felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had doubted himself so many times, but here, in this moment, he realized that all of those doubts had led him to this place of growth. The performance had been more than just a test of his technical ability, it had been a testament to his journey. It had been about overcoming the fear of vulnerability, about letting go of the perfectionism that had once paralyzed him, and about embracing his true self through his music. Backstage after the performance, Jason was surrounded by congratulatory messages from his fellow students and professors. Everyone seemed genuinely impressed by his playing, and the validation was overwhelming. But amidst the praise, Jason found himself reflecting on the most important thing: he had done it for himself. Lila texted him almost immediately after the performance, her excitement palpable in every word. "I knew you'd crush it. That performance was everything. You were amazing, Jason. I'm so proud of you." Jason smiled as he read her message. She had been with him through every step of this journey, and now, he could share this victory with her. He quickly typed a response: "Thanks, Lila. It felt amazing. I think I finally understand what you meant about trusting myself. It was all worth it." Jason didn't have time to dwell on the text, though, as Professor Matthews approached him backstage. The older man was smiling, but his expression was more serious than Jason had seen before. "That was exactly what I was hoping for, Jason," Professor Matthews said, his voice low but filled with pride. "You didn't just play the notes. You played the emotion. You let the music breathe. That's what every pianist should strive for. Now, you're beginning to understand what it truly means to be an artist." Jason's chest swelled with pride at the professor's words. For so long, he had felt like he was just a student trying to keep up. But in that moment, he realized that he was more than that. He was a musician, one who had found his voice. "You've come a long way," Professor Matthews continued, his eyes softening. "Keep pushing yourself. There's still more to learn, but tonight, you proved something important. You proved that you're ready for whatever comes next." Jason nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. He was ready. He was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead because he knew now that the music, the passion, and the authenticity were all he needed to succeed. The days following the performance were a whirlwind. Jason was invited to meet with some of the top professors and pianists at the conservatory, discussing potential future opportunities and projects. But as the excitement of the concert began to die down, Jason found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. This performance had marked a turning point, not just in his career, but in his life. He had proven to himself that he was capable of more than just technical proficiency. He had proven that his music could communicate something deeper, something raw and real. But what Jason had realized most of all was that his journey was far from over. The conservatory had taught him so much, and yet there was still so much left to discover. There would always be challenges to face, setbacks to overcome, and fears to conquer. But now, he understood that he didn't have to face them alone. He had his music, his friends, his family, and the support of those who believed in him. And with that knowledge, Jason knew that he was ready to take on whatever the future held. In the weeks following his performance, Jason felt a shift inside himself. The applause had faded, the praise from professors and peers had settled into quiet acknowledgement, and life at the conservatory had returned to its usual rhythm. But for Jason, everything felt different now. His confidence had been tested and proved, not in the form of a flawless performance, but in the raw authenticity with which he played. He had found his voice, and with it, the courage to face what was to come. Professor Matthews had asked him to stay after one of their lessons to discuss his future at the conservatory. "Jason, I've been thinking about what comes next for you," the professor said, his tone serious but kind. "You've demonstrated incredible growth, but there are more challenges ahead. You've got the talent, but there's a difference between talent and mastery. I want you to consider applying for a prestigious master class in New York." Jason's heart skipped a beat. New York. The idea of performing in one of the world's music capitals sent a rush of excitement and fear through him. It was a huge step, one he wasn't sure he was ready to take. "Why me?" Jason asked, unsure if he was hearing the professor right. "I'm still learning. There's so much more I need to do before I'm anywhere near that level." Professor Matthews smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "You've been doubting yourself, Jason. But you've already done the hardest part, learning to trust yourself. Now, you need to take the next step. This master class could push you beyond anything you've experienced here. It's a challenge, and it won't be easy. But I think you're ready." Jason felt the weight of the decision settle over him. The idea of being in New York, of performing at a level he had only dreamed of, both terrified and thrilled him. It felt like a step into the unknown, but also a chance to prove, not to anyone else, but to himself, that he was capable of greatness. "I'll think about it," Jason said, though he knew deep down that he already knew his answer. He had come too far to let fear hold him back now. Back in his dorm room that night, Jason sat on his bed, the dim light of his desk lamp casting shadows across the room. He couldn't shake the thought of New York. It seemed so far from everything he had known, the small town where his journey had begun, the comfort of his family and friends, and the quiet, predictable rhythm of life at the conservatory. New York represented a world that was both exhilarating and daunting. He grabbed his phone and texted Lila, "Professor Matthews offered me a spot in a master class in New York. It's a huge step, and I'm not sure if I'm ready for it." Almost immediately, Lila's reply came, "Of course you're ready, Jason. You've been ready all along. But I know it's scary. Take your time. You'll know what's right for you when the moment comes. Jason smiled as he read her message. Lila had a way of cutting through his doubts and reminding him of the bigger picture. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about trusting in his own journey. He sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of the decision sink in. New York would change everything. It was the next step in his journey, a journey that had already taken him further than he ever thought possible. That night, Jason made a promise to himself: he would stop running from his fears. He would embrace the uncertainty and the unknown. And he would take the leap. The next morning, after a restless night of thinking, Jason found himself standing in front of Professor Matthews' office. He had made his decision. The doubt still lingered, but they no longer had control over him. He knocked on the door, and when the professor called out to enter, Jason stepped inside. "I've thought about it," Jason said, his voice steady. "I want to apply for the master class. I'm ready." Professor Matthews looked at him, a proud smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm glad to hear that, Jason. You've made a wise decision. This will be a turning point for you. And remember, even though you're taking the next step, the journey is far from over. The real work starts now." Jason nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of excitement and anticipation. "I know. But I'm ready to face it." The weeks leading up to the master class were filled with a mix of preparation and anticipation. Jason spent countless hours practicing, fine-tuning every aspect of his technique, while also delving deeper into the emotional core of the pieces he would perform. He worked with Professor Matthews, refining his interpretation and exploring new dimensions of his music. Each practice session felt like a step closer to something bigger, something that would challenge him in ways he had never imagined. But as the day of his departure approached, Jason couldn't shake the feeling of leaving behind something important. The conservatory had become his home, and the idea of stepping into a new world, one where everything was uncertain, was both thrilling and terrifying. On the day he was set to leave, Jason walked through the halls of the conservatory one last time, his fingers lightly brushing against the piano keys in the practice room. This place had shaped him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend yet. It had pushed him to grow, to confront his fears, and to embrace his weaknesses. It had given him the space to find his true self. And now, he was ready to take that next step. The future was waiting for him, full of challenges and opportunities. But Jason knew one thing for certain: no matter what happened next, he had found his purpose. Music would always be there, his constant companion, guiding him forward. The flight to New York was a blur. Jason barely remembered the hours spent in the air, his mind consumed with thoughts of the unknown. He arrived at the master class venue, a prestigious music academy in the heart of the city, his heart pounding in his chest. The building was magnificent, its grand piano-filled halls echoing with the sounds of students rehearsing. Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he entered the academy, the weight of the legacy that surrounded him. But with that awe came a renewed sense of purpose. This was where he belonged. The moment he sat down at the piano for his first lesson in New York, Jason knew that his journey was just beginning. The road ahead was long, but he had the one thing that mattered most: his music. The master class in New York had been everything Jason had hoped for and more. It was an environment that pushed him harder than he had ever been pushed before, but it was also a place where he truly understood what it meant to be an artist. The professors were strict, and the other students were incredibly talented, but Jason didn't feel like an outsider. Instead, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by like-minded individuals who shared his passion and determination. The first few days were a blur of lessons, practice sessions, and workshops. Jason was introduced to new techniques, new ways of thinking about music, and new interpretations of the pieces he had known for years. He found himself challenged at every turn, but it was the kind of challenge that sparked his growth. It was like every lesson was a door opening to a new world of possibilities. But the most profound realization for Jason came when he saw the other students, some older, some more experienced, but all with their own stories. They all had their struggles, their doubts, their imperfections. And yet, despite everything, they were all there, striving for the same thing, to communicate through their music. That sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose, was something Jason hadn't fully experienced before. One afternoon, during a break between sessions, Jason sat on a bench outside the academy, looking out over the bustling streets of New York. The city was alive, a constant hum of activity, yet there was a strange sense of peace in the chaos. As he watched people pass by, he reflected on how far he had come. Just a few months ago, he had been terrified of performing, unsure of his place in the world. But now, he was here, living his dream, surrounded by people who believed in the same thing he did. Jason's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Lila. "I'm so proud of you, Jason. I knew you could do it. How's New York treating you? Hope you're not too nervous. Remember, you've got this." He smiled as he read her message. Lila had always been there for him, even from afar, and her encouragement meant more to him than he could express. He quickly typed back, "It's amazing, Lila. Hard work, but totally worth it. Can't wait to share everything with you when I get back." Just as he sent the message, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was from his mom. "Jason, I saw your performance video online. I can't believe how far you've come. We're all so proud of you. Keep going, don't let anything hold you back. We love you." Tears welled up in Jason's eyes as he read his mom's words. The love and support he had received from his family, from Lila, and from Professor Matthews had built a foundation that he now stood on firmly. It was a foundation of trust, of belief in himself, and of the unshakable knowledge that he wasn't alone in this journey. Later that week, Jason had a breakthrough moment during a private lesson with one of the master class instructors. He had been struggling with a particular section of a piece, unable to get the phrasing and dynamics just right. But after some feedback and encouragement from the professor, something clicked. "Jason, you've been playing with your head," the professor said, his voice calm but firm. "Now play with your heart. Let go of the technicalities and feel the music. It's not about playing the notes. It's about telling a story." And just like that, Jason let go. He allowed himself to be vulnerable, to feel the music rather than just analyze it. His hands moved effortlessly over the keys, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely connected to the piece. The sound was pure, and it resonated with him in a way he hadn't experienced before. It was like the music was speaking to him, and he was simply the instrument through which it flowed. The professor nodded, a smile crossing his face. "That's it, Jason. Now you're playing from the heart. That's the key." Jason's heart swelled with pride. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when he truly understood what it meant to be a pianist. It wasn't about perfection. It was about honesty. About playing with the vulnerability of your soul. A few months later, Jason's time in New York came to an end. He had learned so much, about music, about himself, and about the world of professional performance. He had grown in ways he had never expected, and he knew that he was only scratching the surface of his potential. As he boarded the plane back to the conservatory, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. From the small-town kid who had once doubted his abilities, to the confident pianist who had just completed a prestigious master class, Jason had proven to himself that there was no limit to what he could achieve. When he returned to the conservatory, he felt different. He was no longer the uncertain student who worried about every note and every mistake. He was a musician, one who had learned to trust himself, to embrace the journey, and to play from the heart. Professor Matthews greeted him with a knowing smile when he returned to his lessons. "I see the change in you, Jason," he said. "You've found your voice." Jason nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "I have. And I'm just getting started." The following weeks were filled with new opportunities. Jason was invited to perform in various recitals and events, and each performance was an opportunity to share his music with the world. His reputation as a rising star in the music world began to grow, but Jason never lost sight of what truly mattered. For Jason, it wasn't about the accolades, the praise, or the recognition. It was about the music, the connection he felt when he played, the emotions he conveyed with each note, and the journey he was on. And as he continued down that road, he knew one thing for certain: he was exactly where he was meant to be. Jason's journey was far from over. But with every step he took, he knew he was closer to realizing the full potential of his music, his heart, and his soul. And that was only the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?